So welcome everybody to this Carnegie Europe panel discussion about the coming elections in Georgia. It's good to see you all. When we planned this discussion, I think I fully expected the Georgian election to be under the microscope and be gathering a lot of attention. But of course, since then, we've seen, unfortunately, the tragic outbreak of conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We've seen ongoing turmoil in Belarus, and we've also seen basically a kind of revolution or disorder in Kyrgyzstan as well. So, but the Georgian election is still incredibly important. We've called it a pivotal election, and I think it's pivotal possibly because it's potentially the first election that Georgia has seen since independence where the ruling party might, for the third time, form a government in Georgia. And it's also a very interesting election because it's being held under new electoral rules. In many ways, it's a new old election because we've got a clash still between the two main figures, the kind of godfather of the government, Bidzina Ivanishvili, former prime minister, and the exiled leader of the United National Movement, former Georgian president Mikheil Saakashvili, still being the two main personalities in this election. And I guess I really want to hear from our panelists whether they think there's going to be any change from that dynamic this time round. So just to introduce our three wonderful panelists, I wish in a way, we could talk for 2 hours with them, but we've only got 1 hour. Giorgi Gogsadze in Tbilisi is going to speak first, is the professor, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Tbilisi State University. I've known Giorgi for many years, and I've always found him a fount of wisdom on Georgia's electoral politics, on polls, anything to do with elections. He's a real oracle. Salome Asatiani, who's joining us from Prague, correspondent of the Georgian service of Radio Liberty. She'll go next. Welcome, Salome. And last but very much not least, Stephen Jones, professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies and of International Relations at Mount Holyoke College in the United States, who's joining us from there. And he's the author of many, many books on Georgia, most notably, perhaps for our purposes, Georgia, A Political History Since Independence. So I've asked each of our speakers to speak for about 8 minutes. That will, I think, hopefully will give us the second half of our discussion, time for some questions and answers, which will be fed through into the chat here, and I will put to our speakers. So we'll start with you, Giorgi.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. In Georgia's unicameral parliament, there are 150 seats, and 50 political organizations and election blocks are ready to compete for 150 seats, as I mentioned. However, after well-known standoff between the ruling party and opposition, a lot of drastic changes were made to our electoral codes. What are new from this standpoint? We are going to elect 100 members of the parliament by party list, or as we call it in Georgia, proportional method. And the rest, 30 members of parliament in single mandate districts, or as we call in Georgia, by majoritarian methods. In previous years, we had almost 50-50 division between members of parliament elected through a party list and through a majoritarian rule. It was 77 to 73. Now, as I told you, it's 120 by party list, 30 by majoritarian. It was a big wish of opposition to have as many people elected by party list as possible. Because when it comes to the majoritarian rule, a ruling party has a big advantage. And for example, in 2016, they won all 73 majoritarian districts. And it means that the situation is drastically going to change drastically, and next parliament, in my opinion, will be more pluralistic rather than it was in 2012 or 2016. So we have two new barriers or two new thresholds. First is 1%. Each political organization needs to surmount 1% barrier to get a parliamentary mandate. And next barrier is so-called 40% barrier for the winner. Winner needs to get more than 40% to take a chance to form the government by its own. Otherwise, there will be a need to have an alliance or coalition, whatever, with other political factions or political organizations to shape the government. So that's very important change to the electoral code. And one old barrier is a 50% barrier for single mandate district. So any candidate needs to get 50 plus 1 vote to be elected in the single mandate district. Otherwise, there will be the second round. So this is the main changes. But we have also some other very important changes. This is the first of all introducing a gender quota of 25%. Now in new parliament, we're going to have increased number of women. At the time being, we have only 9 among 150. So in the next parliament, we will witness minimum 30 women, maybe more. And that's very important, a good change to our electoral code. And one more regulation, new regulation, is that we going to have publications on opinion polls up to the last day of elections. It was prohibited in 2016, but now again we are going to have the opinion polls. It means the temperature will be high, very high, due to this. Observers. Pandemic made its how to say changes to these observers, and usually we had more observers where we are going to have now. But there are 20 international observers already registered, and we're going to have about 150 local observers, including media organization and local NGOs. Now a few words about the polls. That's always interesting. There are several companies, agencies, usually conducting polls in Georgia. I chose IRI. It's one of the most well-known organizations here in Georgia and throughout the world. And I took 2 polls conducted by IRI. One is from the fall 2019 and another from summer 2020. What kind of figures do we have? It's quite interesting. The first of all, number of supporters, I mean, people who are going to vote for the ruling party, it means the Georgian Dream, increased from 23% in fall 2019 up to 33% in summer 2020. 10% increase of percentage points is huge. How it came? Did the Georgian Dream stole some voters or supporters from United National Movement and other organizations which once were affiliated with the UNM Not at all. Furthermore, UNM and some other organizations like the European Georgia or Giorgi Gogsadze's party or Girchi, they gained one more percentage point during this period. So this 10% increase of supporters for the Georgian Dream came from other small parties, including Nino Burjanadze's party, Lelo, the Labour Party, and some other. Also, it is very significant that percentage of so-called undecided people decreased from 32 to 28.
So one minute, Giorgi, for your.
Thank you very much. So, and on the other hand, it means that the opposition, first of all, UNM has very solid and stable supporters, and more likely all these organizations, UNM and organization emerged on the basis of UNM, will act within 25% at the next elections. Tom?
Thank you very much, Giorgi, for that opening presentation. I wonder if you could maybe comment any more about the pandemic. Do you believe that the rise in support for Georgian Dream ruling party is due to their successful handling of the pandemic? And possibly, before we started, you said, unfortunately, cases are rising. Is this going to possibly hurt the standing of the ruling party?
Yes, Tom. And as I told you, this increase came in summer this year. First wave of pandemic went more or less well in Georgia, and government did its job I would say, in a perfect way. Despite the heavy criticism of its social programs and projects, looks people liked all these programs and projects. That's why the increase of supporters was very significant. But taking into account the second wave of pandemic right now, it's hard to say how it will affect the number of supporters for the ruling party or for the opposition. That's a big question.
Right. Thank you, Giorgi. I'm going to turn now to Salome, who's going to continue the conversation for us from Prague. Salome, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here, even though virtually. Still interesting to hear all the perspectives, because it is indeed an important event. I wouldn't maybe say it's pivotal, but it's interesting, these elections, because they are going to really show the direction where Georgia is headed. And I'm afraid I have to start with saying that pretty much any scenario that looms on the horizon doesn't give much ground for optimism, and I will try to outline why. Now, first of all, I would like to comment on the question you posed to Giorgi, Tom. Yes, absolutely. The Georgian Dream, the one big defining trait they had for themselves was that they indeed managed to successfully handle the pandemic. Georgia was a green zone. The cases were minimal into hundreds. They weren't rising, although they came with really draconian measures and curfews and closing of, sealing of borders. Every citizen of Georgia has still go to a mandatory quarantine for 8 days now. It used to be 14 days, but now it's really shifting on a daily basis. The ground in Georgia, we're now approaching almost 1,000 cases per day. Government is now reluctant to reintroduce those strict measures, possibly afraid of losing support. But it's really difficult, I would agree with the previous speaker, to say how this will play out, because it might well be that people will be deterred from going to the polling stations, just being simply scared of the virus. And it might be that the really stern supporters of the ruling of the government or the administrative resource that they will be mobilized. So it might actually not harm the government. It might be the opposite, or it might play out differently. We don't know, but it will definitely, I think, affect the activity of the electorate on the day of the elections, if it's not postponed. So yeah, that's that much for the pandemic. To stick to the upcoming elections, yes, these elections are important, and formally speaking, they are important also because theoretically, formally, and I want to underline that I'm only speaking hypothetically here, they do give Georgia a chance for the first time in its political history, post-Soviet history, to actually form a coalition government. Suppose if the opposition parties win and they manage to get 40, like more cumulatively than Georgian Dream, and Georgian Dream in all polls has now 34, 36%, but they're short of 40%. I personally think they will get 40% and even more because of the majoritarian component, but that's a different thing. Georgia now theoretically does have a chance of like finally ending with this horrible, really malignant Soviet legacy of having pretty much a monstrosity that calls itself a party that controls all branches of government, practically all institutions, takes all the decisions in the executive, small number of people concentrated around the executive branch. And this is really a Soviet legacy when the ruling party becomes the state, pretty much. So yes, if that would end, that would be a great thing. But there is also Saakashvili's factor. There are many factors. So this is just hypothetically just to say that there is this chance looming on the horizon, but very, very unlikely of this chance materializing into Georgia's benefit. But of course, I mean, formal and theoretical things are it's one thing, and context is everything. And I'm afraid we have to briefly, I know we don't have much time, go to the truly pivotal elections, 2012, because we cannot really understand things that have happened since then in Georgia's political landscape if we do not take into consideration what actually happened then on a structural level, and not let alone political level. So what was at that time, to many of us, even those of us that had gotten really passionately against the national movement's rule and Saakashvili's rule because of their ruthless authoritarianism and repressions and so on and so forth, and torture in prisons, some of us, many of us already then, we could see that Georgia was even with the defeat of the national movement, was entering a politically very dangerous territory. Because what happened was that the national movement, unwillingly, to its own biggest surprise, was forced to hand over governing structures that were tailored around this really non-transparent rule of one man and his really close associates, Saakashvili and his associates, controlling pretty much everything, to a political force that was itself structured around one man with immense economic power. Ivanishvili's power is grotesque in comparison to Georgia's GDP, Georgia's budget, 6 billion or 7 billion, figures change. But so, and if you have that much political power and financial power concentrated in one hands, pretty much, in a country when there are no checks and balances, no proper institutions, yes, we have some civil society, media, it's not like totally in an authoritarian society in the classic sense, but of course we were heading towards this dangerous times, and of course now the situation is really not desirable, because most of the things that people feared back then have materialized. And there's been a series of missed opportunities. It has to be outlined. The governing styles, of course, of National Movement and Georgian Dream have been very, very different. And we can talk about that in the question and answer section. But really important reforms have not materialized. Judiciary remains a huge problem. And even the judges that have become associated with some of the most scandalous criminal cases during Saakashvili's times, and the ones that the Georgian Dream itself was capitalizing on, have been handed lifetime appointments by the Georgian Dream, for example. Not much has changed regarding the economy or the economic outlook. The progressive taxation is still banned constitutionally. Same thing with prosecutors, and I need to mention one case that happened 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. A teenager, a disturbed teenager boy that was detained because he wrote some graffiti marks in his on the walls of his former school, he ended up at the hands of a prosecutor that had been associated with a torture case during Saakashvili times, and even Georgian state had lost a case in Strasbourg. So not only Georgian Dream had retained prosecutors and other in the law enforcement agencies that were associated personally in torture and mistreatment and inhumane treatment during Saakashvili times. An innocent teenager ended up at her hands. And then after 2 days of interrogation, the boy took his own life and committed suicide. So these cases show that all this talk about, the repressive regime of Saakashvili and we are being different is pretty much the facade. Of course, certain things have changed, but fundamentally not much. And one thing I need to also underline is that in 2015, there was an important reform of the Ministry of Interior that it split into two. And now we have a new state security agency, the so-called SUSI, which according to, I'll be very quick.
1 minute,
according to most of the watchdogs and analytical centers, is unregulated, has too much power at its hands, and it's still being used for political purposes. So now in this upcoming, the question of who is running Georgia, who is ruling Georgia is one big question that's unanswered, because it's not easy to answer. We know that Ivanishvili has retained his power. It's really difficult to, it's been a challenge to bring him somehow in the constitutional framework. He was a prime minister, then he resigned, then he had no formal power, but still retained his actual power, of course. Then now he's the head of the Georgian Dream party. But we don't know actually who makes day-to-day decisions. How are things decided? How much does he participate? But we know that if should he be willing, so even our prime minister, Giorgi Gogsadze, who is by far the most popular figure in the Georgian Dream, can just resign tomorrow without any explanation. This has happened before. So this, of course, creates huge problems for accountability, transparency, and good governance. And I want to quickly mention, if I can still have like 40 seconds, the problems of the opposition that now, of course, with this new proportional or almost proportional system, small parties are trying very much to capitalize on it, and because they have a chance of ending up in the parliament, 1% is the new threshold. And the discourse, political discourse, somehow they're trying to frame that it's no longer the fight between, let us make it no longer the fight between Ivanishvili and Saakashvili. Let's end with this malignant, malicious tradition. Let's go forward and vote for smaller parties, which would be a wonderful thing, of course, but it's really, again, unlikely that will happen, because the biggest oppositional party is still National Movement. It lags behind Georgian Dream. It has around 17–18%, but without the National Movement, it's unfeasible to imagine future coalition government. And the National Movement has nominated Saakashvili as their prime minister, who is, as you all know, has no more Georgian citizenship, and he is wanted on several criminal charges in Georgia, but he still says that he will, in every election, he says he's going to return. So yeah, things are murky. Things are, third term, even Shevardnadze didn't manage to pull it off, to stay for the third term in the government. So yeah, we will see where Georgia is headed, but things don't look very optimistic, I have to say.
Thank you very much, Salome, for that rather bleak point of view. Just a quick question to you about, last time in 2016, people were waiting for some kind of third force, and this time we've got, I guess, people bidding to be a third force. You had this launch of the new party called Lelo with much fanfare. You've also got European Georgia now rejecting its former patron Saakashvili. Do any of these potential third forces have the potential to make a breakthrough and become a significant force in Georgia?
Not on these elections, no. I mean, even cumulatively, I don't see it happening and them reaching 40%. That's out of the question. Yes, the European Georgia, the splinter group, it's comprised of figures that used to be very close associates of Saakashvili, and now they're trying to define their identity pretty much in rejection of Saakashvili. So Saakashvili is still a big factor. If they came up with this grotesque slogan also like a couple of days ago. If you kick Ivanishvili with a fist, you elbow Saakashvili. We don't need both of them. So it's grotesque. I understand, everybody understands what they're trying to do. They're trying to dissociate themselves. They're saying we take responsibility for the success of national movement as well as for the, as they call, failures. And in fact, they refer to really horrible things that went on during their rule, like I mentioned, torture and so on, and repressions and businesses and so on, extortions. But I do not really see this strategy materializing, especially within these elections, because of course they have some program. It's all very right-wing economically. They speak about other issues as well, but in Georgia, it's still about personalities. It's still about passions. It's still about issues, and they're forced to play along with it. So this fist and elbow thing, and it's not going to, I don't know. It's hard to say, but I don't see it happening. As for Lelo and other parties, Girchi is this libertarian party. They have their own electorate, and they will have some small, they are pretty much, I would say they're the only consistent party that have their own small group of people who support them, and they go on doing their business and their issues. Lelo is a new organization, so I don't see them garnering a lot of support in order to have a say. Of course, they will end up in the parliament, but so yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Salome. So we're going to turn now to Stephen Jones. I should just mention that if please do start sending in your questions via the YouTube chat. They'll be being rounded up and passed to me, and then we can pass on to a discussion. Stephen, how many Georgian elections have you witnessed in your career?
Since 1991, all of them, I think.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to your broader perspective on this and
yeah, okay. I mean, I must say I do share Salome's rather bleak assessment of this election, but what I would like to do is put this in perhaps a broader global context and talk about the role that elections play in democracy building, because it's very often seen as crucial to any progress in democratic development. And often we refer specifically to the role of elections in Georgian politics as being fundamental to democratic progress. So, you know, I live in the United States, so I have, in the last 4 or 5 years, thought very differently about the role of elections in politics. And I have lost some of my faith in the ability of elections to support, if you like, the democratic pillars of our American political system. But let me just then put this in context if I can. I think the last decade in Europe and the US has shaken our faith in the strength and the sustainability of democracy and its institutions, such as elections. The US, for example, is no longer the winnable model for other aspiring democracies. Its electoral system, many features of which were exported around the world triumphantly, have proved to be quite dysfunctional, I should say, and manipulable. Elections themselves are never enough on their own to maintain a healthy democracy. They're a double-edged sword. They can increase accountability and empower citizens, or they can lead to nationalist hysteria, the repression of minorities, or the negligence of minorities at least, and they can legitimize dictators. In post-Soviet Eurasia, arguably, most elections have negatively impacted democratic impulses. And the events in Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Belarus over the last couple of years have shown change comes not necessarily from elections, but from protest or rejection of elections. Western experts, State Department, planners, international organizations since the collapse of communism have focused on elections as the linchpin of successful democracy. Sam Huntington's 2 turnover test, or 2 changes of power as a result of elections, is just one example of the Western emphasis on the centrality of elections to democratic success. But David Van Raybroek, in his intriguing book, Against Elections, The Case for Democracy, calls this approach electoral fundamentalism. He points to innumerable empirical studies and concrete examples which suggest the focus on elections is a gross simplification of how democracies function and survive. We cannot adequately assess the connection between elections and democratic accountability in Georgia, for example, without examining the role of money in electoral campaigns, the level of popular trust in political institutions, the effectiveness of political parties, or the vast economic inequalities in Georgian society. For me, Georgian elections, including the coming 2020 parliamentary elections, exemplify a misplaced faith in elections, along with parties, as instruments of accountability and promoters of a diffusion of power. I've followed Georgia's elections since 1991. Some have been genuine expressions of Georgian citizens' will, but most have consolidated parties in power and cemented the privileges of Georgia's ruling political circles. The 2020 elections represent some progress, and Giorgi talked about this. They've expanded inclusion, so now 1 in 4 candidates on party lists will be women, although there's no equivalent quota for national minorities, which in my view there should be. There's now a 1% electoral barrier, which will produce a more diverse parliament, but there is the danger of a much less disciplined one as well. And greater proportional representation may reduce the incumbent Georgian Dream's political advantage. All these are important concessions from the Georgian Dream, which they made in March of 2020, and they are a recognition of the need for political compromise. Most importantly, in 2020, now, no one knows what the electoral outcome will be. Uncertainty about the results is always a good sign. Finally, an NDI poll in mid-September suggested, although I think this is an exaggeration, 88% of eligible voters will participate despite COVID, though 59%, according to NDI, still don't know who they're voting for. Yet for these elections to work as instruments of greater accountability, they have to be competitive, definitive, they have to enjoy voter confidence, provide accessible information on party policies and the differences between them, and they have to lead also to visible outcomes. One would also hope the elections would promote some degree of social integration rather than fragmentation. But despite the signing this September 12th of the Code of Conduct by over 40 Georgian parties, a good sign, I don't see much evidence of electoral features that will lead to a more qualitative democracy. And I'm going to go through some points here as to why I'm skeptical.
Okay, you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, let's start with the most serious problem. Elected representatives should govern because they've been given the power to do so by electors, but they will not, due to Ivanishvili's overwhelming, and Salome referred to this, overwhelming economic and political influence. This is the greatest challenge to the election and to Georgian democracy right now. The increased party list system helps opposition parties, but it also magnifies the power of party leaders who control the lists and reduces, in the provinces at least, direct accountability to constituents. The elections are competitive, we could say, but hardly fair. Georgian Dream has overwhelming resources, financial and administrative. This is particularly true in the regions where the election process is opaque and Georgian Dream members have significant control over local government, as well as influence over who gets appointed to the precinct electoral commissions. Polls suggest voter confidence in political parties and citizens' knowledge of what the parties are offering is very low. This is because Georgia's parties have no staying power. They're volatile, appearing, disappearing, moving from one alliance to another. We have a raft of new parties in this election, as in almost all previous ones. As far as I know, every single parliamentary election since 1990 has operated under different rules. This reflects a persistent disconnect between the population and the government that has not changed in 30 years, of my observation at least, despite 9 parliamentary and 7 presidential elections. Despite the agreement of a number of opposition parties on joint candidates this time round, a government of opposition parties is not durable, in my view. Right now, the only thing uniting them is opposition to the Georgian Dream. In Saakashvili's second term, we saw the same pattern of a weak opposition alliance united by opposition to Saakashvili. But what happens when they have to choose a prime minister? And how will they develop common policies? It's hard to conceive. Okay, I'm wrapping up now, Tom. For these reasons, I believe the 2020 election is unlikely to foster greater democracy or accountability. If these elections once again fail to produce any outcome, meaning expected change or an improvement in people's lives and greater economic security, they will only deepen political apathy and chip away at Georgian citizens' faith in democracy. So, sorry for the pessimism.
Yes, indeed, quite a pessimistic outlook. Although I mean, you would agree, of course, Stephen, that Georgia has made some progress, quite a lot of progress since 1990. But I guess, would you also share this view that it's that Salome's view that a third term for one ruling party is unprecedented in Georgia, and this is unhealthy? Is this?
Yeah, most definitely unhealthy. But so, I mean, we had the experience of a Georgian parliament in 92 to 95, and I think there were 26 parties in that parliament because there was 0% barrier, and it was chaotic. I don't know. I suspect 8 or 9 parties will get through and will have maybe play a significant role in the new Georgian parliament. That definitely would be progress. But as I said, there's going to be some ambivalence about that, in the sense that we don't know how those parties will actually effectively cooperate and actually create outcomes and results, which is absolutely essential to sustaining people's belief that democracy actually works.
Thank you, Stephen. So we've got a little under half an hour for some discussion. There's a bit of pushback against, about the pessimism in 2 of these questions. One asking about the role of media and civil society, which are both, of course, fairly independent in Georgia, and another which says, what about the quality, maintenance, growth or decline of experienced career civil service workers within the Georgian government? Ministers within government are being managed well or poorly. Who would like to take either of those points about media and civil society, what's their role, or about the civil service? Volunteers, please. Okay, over to you, Stephen.
Me? Okay, I was going to hand it over to the real experts over there.
Okay, Salome, Giorgi, would either of you like to take that one? Okay, you start.
Okay, I'll start. I mean, civil society has always been one of the more positive aspects of Georgian democracy. The media has not. On the other hand, let's compare it to media in other places it's in the world, and it's not that much different. What we've got is fragmentation of the media in Georgia. So we have Tavari Achi, with the main opposition channel, and then we have Maestro, supporting the government. And you go to whichever channel you feel is perhaps supportive of your particular point of view. We have the same thing in the United States. MSNBC is more liberal, Fox News is more conservative. I would guess it's a pluralistic media, which is good. But in terms of its quality and its objectivity, I think it comes as low as it does in the United States. Civil service, it still hasn't reached the degree of professionalism that's necessary for running the state in an effective and honest manner. Salome referred to the judiciary. It's still one of the great weaknesses. If you can't trust the rule of law in Georgia, which you still cannot, especially in the business world, these are such important factors in constraining the progress of Georgian democracy.
Any of either of our two Georgians like to weigh in at this point? Salome.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just a quick point on civil society. Well, media, Stephen is absolutely right. Media is, you do get this pluralistic opinions, but it's very much, we have some TV channels, and it's television still plays a big role, especially in the regions. We have some TV channels that are trying to play the middle ground, but the defining big television national television companies, Tavari Archi and Imedi, are openly, directly, vehemently pro-national movement and pro-government, pro-Georgian Dream. And so basically you have this really split reality. Anything happens during the day in the country's life, you can see two absolutely different versions of the same event. When it comes to civil society, I would like to just briefly say something that I've been observing and also talking to my friends and colleagues. Yes, we do have vibrant, we've had it for 20 years already, since the really bad times in the 1990s and the wars have ended. But somehow it seems to me that big civil society organizations, including Young Lawyers Association, that has been the central force in Georgia's opening and democratization, they had somehow more influence, I would say, or say, or during the times of the Rose Revolution than now. I think maybe this goes along with what Stephen was describing, the general nihilism or the general disillusionment with these democratic ideals. Also because in our part of the world, the civil society or so-called non-governmental organizations, they're, in essence, they're structured differently than in Western countries. We rarely have, almost never have the grassroots thing. It's mostly middle class people. You have to be able to speak English. You have to have some networks in order, and then get funds. So you're mostly accountable to your foreign donors. So the split from if there is such a thing as the general population, and these civil society organizations that talk about transparency, accountability, good governance, and independent judiciary, has only widened. This is my subjective perception, but a very strong one. And maybe because also these organizations do not, very few of them, there's only one, EMC, the recent one, that is trying to combine social rights, poverty, and really pressing problems for Georgia, because right now, after the I don't even know if anyone would want to come to power in Georgia right now, because Georgia is headed towards really, really dire economic outlook, and things were bad as they were. So the very few organizations are trying to combine when they talk about injustice, to start from the social perspective as well. So it's not just abstract rights, and maybe that's another reason. But yeah, we have these organizations, they play they are on media, they talk, they comment on things, but they used to be somehow more influential in day-to-day agenda during the last years of Shevardnadze's rule and in the aftermath of the Rose Revolution.
Thank you. One thing that always intrigues me about Georgian politics is that apart from the Labour Party, which is a very old and rather discredited party, there never seems to be a kind of left-wing option in Georgia, despite its many high levels of poverty and unemployment. I don't know, Giorgi, whether in your polling you've ever seen, you think there's a gap in the market for a more left-wing party in Georgia. I don't know if you want to comment now or later on that issue. But there's another, you can come back to that. There's a question also, which I don't know if Giorgi or Salome you want to comment on, which is about whether this terrible Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, which I'm spending most of my time covering at the moment when I'm not in a discussion like this, is affecting Georgia, and obviously whether the minority populations, the Armenian Azerbaijani populations, whether this might affect them, their votes in the election, in fact. I don't know if either of you wanted to.
I can't hear.
Okay, sorry. Let me start from the minorities, okay? This is my very important issue, and I agree with Stephen that the quota should be introduced not only for women, but also for minorities. It's my belief. There is an important shift in minority regions. At least Marneuli became very pluralistic from that point of view. There is no blind support to the ruling party. Marneuli, at least part of Marneuli, supports UNM. I'm not saying
Marneuli is an Azerbaijani minority.
Yeah, and it's Azerbaijan is mostly populated by Azeri population, and not giving an assessment it's good or not who they support. In general, it's very important shift that now regions of minority starting to engage actively Georgia's political life. And it's a first very good step towards the integration, successful integration. And by the way, Misha's statement on Karabakh, we all know that I mean, Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan. It was done deliberately. Issue is very delicate, and I would suggest to all Georgian politicians not to be involved in that. But Misha thought about his party. He knows that UNM does not have too much chances in Javakheti region. But as well as they have strong position in Kvemo-Kartli, he tries to get as many votes as possible. It was a very provocative statement, but from electoral viewpoint, that was correct. As for, let me have a few points about economics. Tom, once we have strong economy here in Georgia, we're going to have strong political organizations. So far, problem is not small business or medium-sized business. The problem is big business. It is under total control of the government and the ruling party. Once it will be emancipated from that kind of control, 10 years ago it was, I mean, Saakashvili's regime, now it is Ivanishvili's regime. And once it is emancipated, then we can talk about the real pluralism in political system. Thank you.
And I would like to just add a quick point that I think we should mention today, just as a fact for those who might not be following. It's partially somehow not indirectly pertains to the Karabakh conflict that recent, like in a week ago in Georgia, suddenly the long-standing issue of David Gareja, the 6th century monastery and the border with Azerbaijan suddenly heated up again. And a lot of commentators would tell you that this is Georgian Dream trying to play on the very ethno-nationalist sentiments. And this Gareja monastery is a very sacred place for the Georgian imaginary, and parts of it fall on the Azerbaijani territory. And so 2 cartographers have been arrested now, and they're being accused of deliberately hiding some maps that would be beneficial to Georgia. So basically the issue is why this issue, why now, why the arrest, and why, especially with Karabakh going on and the unpredictable tragedies unfolding. So this also again shows that all sort of tools are on the display again, like working, be it intimidation, physical or moral or nationalist sentiments, or everything, the old concert, so to speak, the pre-electoral, pretty immoral at times. We're still dealing with the same thing. This is not new for Georgia's electoral campaign, but it's sad, of course, to see the same thing happening over and over again. So yeah.
Tom, maybe I could go back to your question about the absence of left-wing parties in Georgia. Left-wing parties have always been at a disadvantage in post-Soviet states. Georgia is no exception, because of the Soviet legacy. right? So anything that's associated with left-wing politics is associated with the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that in Georgia, there is actually a historical legacy of social democracy during the First Republic. I think, it's not just left-wing politics that is unable to find its place in the sort of Georgian political theater. It's actually what we might call liberal parties as well. The Republicans famously the Republican Party, I should say, in Georgia, famously stuck to rather liberal views on questions of minorities. It was very pro-European, pro-Western, and of course they still exist, but they've really never had any political support. I think the same could be said for Irakli Alessania's Free Democrats, which has also disappeared, right? European Georgia today maybe has some of those elements, but of course, European Georgia also has the problem of its association with the UNM. So it's very interesting as to why, given the situation of Georgia, given that if you actually talk to most Georgians, or if you look at the polling, what their concerns are about, economic concerns, about health, right, employment. I don't think I would be exaggerating if I said to you around 60% of Georgians, if themselves would admit they're not really employed. Why isn't it, that social democracy or some other left-wing movement that will address these problems has no foothold? It's an intriguing question. I think it may be changing somewhat. My experience with the younger generation in Georgia is that there is a revival of interest, for example, in the First Republic, precisely because it was a social democratic state. But it's a long way to go for any potential left-wing opposition in Georgia.
I would like to add to that just a quick point, if possible. I completely agree, and it's been a paradox to me too, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. But one possible explanation of that would be that after the Rose Revolution, we didn't just go through political changes. We went through a paradigm shift in terms of just thinking about Georgia's place in the world and what's good and what's bad. So this mythology, the mythology that was installed back then, that the need to modernize, foreign direct investment is the most important thing. Workers' rights are Soviet backward thing. So we have to overcome our backwardness, the split, the division coming from the high echelons of the government, of society, between the modern and backward ones, and free business, free market, low taxes. These are still very much unchanged, and I would say more. I was joking with a Marxist friend of mine the other day that in a Gramscian sense, these ideas have become even more hegemonic after the national movement is gone, because back then, at least when Bendukidze would speak about these issues, the chief economist and brain behind most of the reforms, they were perceived as some ideas that you could agree with or not disagree with. So there was some protests. Now these ideas are like air. It's very, very difficult to challenge them because of the educational institutions are just propagating the same thing. And many of them, some of them founded by Bendukidze himself, but others too, like state universities you can encounter, they don't teach proper political philosophy, proper political economy. And so, yeah, that would be one reason. And another quick, just to mention quickly, this also goes back to the Soviet times, I think, because in contrast to, former colonies of the Western world, where political economy was a big thing, and that's why these colonies now then produce so many world-renowned intellectuals who were writing about the world economy, so on and so forth. In Soviet Union, the opposition towards the Soviet rule, because political economy was everywhere and Marxism was really being shoved down people's throats, was more poetic, was more philosophical, was more nationalist. So nobody, I remember Stephen has written about this better than anyone in the world, that if you just take early 1990s and see what the people, the new political elites, things they were saying, Georgia will survive on its mineral water alone, the Borjomi, and we are blessed by Mother Mary. And so absolutely no understanding of reality. So that is a Soviet legacy coupled with this paradigm shift that happened since 2003 in the subsequent years. I think that would explain why it's so difficult to just break through this paradigm somehow. But I agree, I also see younger generation coming who understand what's happening, who read a lot. And so, yeah, we just have to wait and see, but it's a long prospect.
Thank you so much. Now we have 5 minutes left. We might run over a couple of minutes as we started a little late, and they've got 2 remaining questions. And I might ask each of you to address those questions or make any concluding remarks, but quite briefly. The 2 remaining questions are, would the panelists say that Georgian Dream has exhausted itself in terms of their ability to govern? If so, even if they secure a simple majority, are they going to face a crisis of legitimacy? That's the first question. And the second one is an important issue we haven't mentioned so far. Do relations with Russia play a role in the election? So why don't we go in the order of our speakers. So Giorgi, any concluding remarks? And if you want to address either of those or both of those questions.
Yes, Tom, a few remarks. First of all, about Russia. Now Russia is weakening. It will take time for the whole world to witness that process. And it is very important for Georgia to be very cautious, very careful, attentive to all geopolitical processes, and not to provoke the situation on its own. Okay, and Russia, I don't think that Russia's interference into these elections will be significant. I don't think. As for the outcome of elections, I'll be very extraordinary, telling that the Georgian Dream will take a big majority. No, I mean from 45 to 50%. I expect them to win almost all single mandate districts and about 40% of party list mandates. But it's very difficult to have a good prediction. I cannot bring good arguments because booming pandemic makes its significant changes to the situation. But one more thing, Tom, the Karabakh conflict itself plays in favor of the Georgian Dream. It's well-known fact that there is a war near to your borders. It consolidates the society under government's umbrella. And I think that this war will bring at least several points or several mandates to the ruling party. Tom?
Thank you very much, Giorgi. Over to you, Salome.
Well, as for the first question, yeah, if the question is posed so openly, yes, I would say it is really alarming what this government or this political force will do in its 3rd term with its, we have to also know that this is not the same Georgian Dream that came to power in 2012. Back then, it was a loose coalition of many parties, including the Republican Party. Stephen mentioned our not popular, but ages of one of the I guess the oldest in post-Soviet times, political party, liberal figures, influential figures, and that's why I'm saying it's a missed opportunity. Back then, in 2012 to 2016, these figures in Georgian Dream did have some leverage to push through these essential reforms, which did not materialize, and that's why. So since then, the political force has been basically assembled with a servitude towards Ivanishvili. So now, with the pandemic and the economic prospects being so bleak, and the country is basically headed into a very large and intense crisis, social, economic, health wise. So it's not a good prospect. I'm afraid that it will be this force with a incompetent, nepotistic, corrupt, so on and so forth, and non-transparent, what's most important. Although I would agree with Stephen that the alternatives are not on the horizon that much, and alternatives have their own shortcomings, such as chaos and so forth. As for Russia, Russia, of course, always has a close eye on Georgia. Russia will never let go of Georgia, never will leave Georgia alone to decide its own political fate, good or bad. Russia has been a big factor in fostering of anti-Western statements, in the increase of the skepticism towards political process and towards democracy as well. It has big influence over our religious circles. Georgian ethno-nationalism, paradoxically, somewhat, but not really, still feeds on our closeness in terms of orthodoxy with Russia. So, and you know, the biggest challenge probably Georgian Dream ever faced, and also the event that made Georgian Dream show its repressive side openly, because they had to disperse the protesters in very excessive force, and people losing their eyes, young people, young girls with rubber bullets, was because the Georgian Dream allowed for a Russian MP to sit in a chair of Georgia's head of the parliament, which on a factual level, some people would say didn't mean much, but on a symbolic level, that was a red line for many Georgians. So the relationship between the Georgian Dream's rule, Ivanishvili, who of course has made his fortune in Russia, and Russia is a big topic. We can't cover it now, but yeah, we can't, I don't imagine, unfortunately, any prospect anytime soon that Russia will not be keeping a close eye on where things are going in Georgia.
Thank you, Salome. I don't anticipate that you're going to end us on an optimistic note, Stephen, but after a rather gloomy but fascinating discussion, but the last word is going to be yours.
Yeah, well, I agree with Giorgi. I think that Georgian Dream will manage to get the minimum 40%, largely through the single mandate constituencies, where the incumbent party, particularly Georgian Dream, because it has so many more resources than the opposition, will probably win. However, it might be more constrained in this parliament, because in the last parliament it had a super majority, it had a constitutional majority. You know, a different parliament with a raucous but probably not united opposition will perhaps constrain Georgian Dream, but I wouldn't bet on Georgian Dream's future at all. It's not a cohesive party. It's not a party really at all. It's united around Ivanishvili, and it doesn't really have, as Salome was really pointing to, you know, in the very troubling, serious economic conditions that Georgia is going to face in the future. It does not seem to have any particular program or solution to that. Not that anybody can come up with an easy solution to it, but you know, there are particular figures in Georgian Dream, like Gogsadze, the mayor of Tbilisi, who seem to have some degree of popularity. But other than that, you know, I don't see this party really producing what Georgian people want, which is some change. They want some stimulus to the economy. They want employment. And a Georgian Dream is not going to provide that. As far as Russia is concerned, you know, it has so many things on its plate right now in Belarus, in the part of the world that you focus on, Tom, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And now Kyrgyzstan, although it's not paying much attention to Kyrgyzstan either, you know, that Georgia is not a big focus right now. Yeah, so there we are.
Well, maybe that is a positive note to end on, Stephen. And I would agree with you. I think Georgia is way down Russia's list of priorities, and may it remain so.
Right.
Belarus, Ukraine, Karabakh, Germany now, I think, are way up the list. So it's been not an uplifting discussion, but I think an extremely thoughtful, rich, and interesting one. We've not just discussed this coming election. We've had a really fascinating discussion about Georgian democracy in general, and Georgia's problems and challenges. So I'd love there to be a big round of applause. You certainly deserve one. But on behalf of everyone watching, on behalf of Carnegie Europe, I'd very much like to thank Giorgi Gogsadze, Salome Asatiani, and Stephen Jones for joining us today, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.